decade. And when we wake up from that nap, our boredom and our discontent has turned into bigger things, much bigger things. Things like rage, things like addiction, things like disease and accidents, the things that will force us to change. And bingo, that is exactly what we're waiting for. Something that will force us to change as opposed to choosing change ourselves. Because then our precious egos get to stay safe. In the short term, this is a way better option. Like just chill out in the basement with throw cushions and the scented candles, and you're all safe until a truckload of pain and suffering comes in and makes you move, right? We would much rather have this, and we would much rather hear stories that reinforce that limiting belief. Right? So long as there's some hands down, full of trauma, clear as day reason that meant I had no choice but to change, everybody else around me gets to stay safe and comfortable. So long as my story starts with me picking up the pieces, everyone gets to keep marching down the street, hand in loving hand, with the status quo, following the unspoken rules, living the life they're supposed to live, living the life that everyone around them expects them to live. And there is a certain kind of security in that, a certain kind of relief. But here's the thing I've learned about security and relief. They do not add up to our highest potential. And more so, they don't add up to the search party required to find out what our highest potential might be. So I call a little BS. I want the gusto. And if I've got to make moves from the basement to get it, count me in. The minute that I see it walking past the front door, I want it to know that I'm awake and paying attention. And I want it to know as soon as I get a suspicious feeling that it's coming by, I want it to know that I'm going to run up the front stairs and I'm going to grab my life by its shirt collars and I'm going to say, drop everything because Gusto's here and we got to go. And I'm going to do all of that knowing that somewhere down the road, someone is going to stop me and they're going to point back at the life that I just left and they're going to say, why? And I will say, because that is what this one glorious life is about. It is about going for the gusto and accepting the dare that is life. Now, before I move on to a short reading, and then wine break, and then Q&A, I'm going to wrap with a quote. This is something I found in the Sacred Community Text, otherwise known as Instagram. Some of you might be familiar with this. It's by a woman named Laura McCowan, and it goes a little like this. The normal question is this bad enough for me to have to change? The question we should be asking is this good enough for me to stay the same? And the real question underneath it all is, am I free? So in the end, maybe I did tell you what this book is really about. It is about becoming free. It is about becoming unbound, hence the title. It is about saying no to expectations and limitations and yes to the dare that is life. So I am going to read. Before I do that, I want to know who, not that you have to be, you can certainly read the book without being, who's a skier? Or snowboarder? Yeah. Okay, so maybe 40%, 50% of the room. Nice. Who has skied outside of Canada? 1, 2, 3. Okay. Oh, yeah, she's remembered. Yeah. This is great. So I'm going to read a section that took place outside of Canada. I know that this is, at least I know this is one of Wendy's favorites of the book. It's one of my favorites as well. And this takes place probably about just over halfway through the trip, and I was about halfway through the vertical feet that I needed, and this takes place in Chamonix in the French Alps, which is a stunningly, anybody been there? One person. So you may resonate a little with this, hopefully. I can tell you with certainty that I've seen some of the most beautiful things this world has to offer, both in my travels and in my life spent as an invertebrate voyeur. I've watched the giant equatorial sun light up the rude and rugged coastline of West Africa. I've seen the way a snake moves when it charms. I was there the day my niece claimed her place in this world, saw her do it with my own 2 eyes. I can scan through 1,000 beautiful images, but the collection is not complete without Chamonix. You can't help but be captivated the minute you see her, the way she sits on her throne high in the mountains of France. It's her duality that does it, her beauty, a spellbinding mixture of everything in life that is permanent and everything that, poof, is gone in a flash. Many people have vanished in Chamonix, swallowed up by her ancient jaws of rock and ice. She is a valley of life, cast in a granite shadow of death. She stands sure-footed, betwixt and between, straddling 2 worlds with ease. And given the messages of birth and burial that came to me in the mountains in Japan, Chamonix was the perfect teacher. She's also sacred, a mountaineer's version of Vatican City. Exchange Bibles, flowing capes and crosses for Gore-Tex, beacons, and boots. Replace rosaries and zucchettos with ice axes and helmets, swap out a prayer rope for a heavy-duty harness, and church bells for cable cars dangling in the sky. It's all the same. Chamonix is where you come to learn faith firsthand. Her official reign as the spiritual center of snow began when she hosted the first ever Winter Olympic Games in 1924. But I have a feeling she claimed the right to call herself the Holy One the moment her jagged edges were thrust into the sky, the moment she was anointed with that coronet of ink black granite. Upon arrival, I found a small bar on the edge of town and cozied up in a seat by the window. The temperatures in the area had dropped and a dusting of snow was floating through the air like smoke. I watched as it swirled on the ground and then rose with the wind, curling around the necks of the people walking by. I sipped my hot chocolate and looked across the valley to the Aiguille du Midi, a peak in the Mont Blanc Massif. There are peaks in the range much higher than this, some pushing 14 and 15,000 feet, but none are as striking as Midi. At her apex is a tapered granite tower pointing directly at the sky. It looked like a pin held firm, ready to pop a giant blue balloon. When I looked at her, I couldn't help but think she was a needle, commissioned by God to mark the small sliver of space between heaven and earth. I spent the whole afternoon in that spot, sipping my drink and looking out at the mountains, each of which looked bruised and a little bit battered. The snow that had fallen wasn't quite enough to conceal the thin layers of ice. All the stuff that was living right below the surface was slowly becoming exposed, and I realized I was looking at myself, at the parts of me I'd never had the courage to face. I'd never felt as vulnerable or as stripped down as I did when I arrived in Chamonix, so I did the only thing one does. I finished my hot chocolate and I took myself to church, which was the mountains, by the way. The next morning, the thermostat read negative 31 degrees Celsius, negative 23.8 Fahrenheit. I was in California in January. I had to explain what that temperature was, but I think you guys get it. It would have been easy for me to stay under the covers of my tiny hotel room, coffee in one hand and book in the other, but I couldn't because I heard what was becoming a familiar and welcome voice. "Oh, darling," she said, "it's time. Go on up to the mountains." I threw on a few extra layers and I went, hope in one hand, prayer in the other. The skiing that day was screamingly fast. A week of hot weather, like hot enough to melt most of the snow, followed by cold weather, like cold enough to cold enough to freeze everything that had melted, makes for, well, giant fucking sheets of ice. The conditions that day were fast, designed for speed. I skied as quickly as I could, mostly because I wanted back on the chairlift. Don't get me wrong, the chairlift was cold, but when I skied, the cold was so cold that it hurt. No matter how much effort I put into ensuring that my face was covered, the frozen air shot through my neck warmer and scarf like 1,000 bees, stinging my nose, cheeks, and chin. Once on the chairlift, I could recover, sitting like a dog, tightly curled, paws tucked, snout away from the wind. I spent the entire morning racing, just trying to get back to that place. The other reason for the speed was my grandfather. This may sound strange, as he died in 1997, but on occasion since then, I'd felt his presence, even seen him. And as it turns out, this was one such occasion. It happened on my fourth chairlift up. I turned to my right, and there he was, long legs crossed over one another, a big smile on his face. He motioned for me to move closer to him. "Faster," he said, as he wrapped one of his arms around my shoulder, keeping me warm. "A little bit faster." I did as my grandfather told me. I pointed my skis downhill, and I went. There was no time for turning. I found my grandfather waiting for me on the next lift, and the one after that, and the one after that. And once I realized he would be there for the day, I went even faster, doing everything to get back to him as quickly as possible. I flew. It was as if the cords had been cut. The parachute I'd been dragging was no longer there. At some point, I was skiing so fast I could feel my body pushing against gravity. And by the afternoon, I felt like I had crossed some sort of threshold, like I'd moved through a trembling, bat out of hell kind of speed and arrived at a steady G-force warp speed. In other words, I was Jonathan Livingston Seagull on skis. And so that's how I spent the rest of the day, half of it tucking down a mountain at breakneck speed and the other half in the arms of my grandfather, half of it freezing, the other half thawing. One of the final chairlifts, my grandfather pulled me in close. "Isn't it amazing," he whispered, "how fast you can go when you've let go of it all? Like a bird, like a rocket to the moon." I started to cry. "Just you and the mountains and God," he said. I went back every day for the next 5 days, and there he was, waiting on the chairlift, my church pews, in his navy blue ski suit. It was bliss. It was freedom. It was a safety I'd never known. For the first time in my life, I felt all of the love and none of the fear. And so I broke myself there. I dropped everything I'd been carrying, and I watched it tumble down the mountain into the shadows of the valley. I became unrestrained. I became unbound. The fissure had become a giant crevasse, and I was wide open. Day after day, I let the mountains pull me further and further apart. I let them shatter me and all of my beliefs into thousands of pieces, knowing that I would eventually get glued back together somehow, some way. I let the mountains tear me down, and after each run, I sat on a seat in the sky with my grandfather. I was tattered and torn, unanchored and unfettered, and I was loved. And by the end of the week, I was bone tired. Yes, I'd added 150,000 vertical feet to my total, but the energy drain was mostly due to the fact that 6 days in the mountains with God is exhausting. I've heard people talk about having to make a deal with the devil, but in my experience, you've got to do the same with God. The only difference is that one negotiation is about what you're going to get, and the other is about what you're going to give. Speaking of giving, there's wine at the back. We're going to take a 5-minute break so that you can do that, and then we'll answer any questions you have about skiing, about traveling, about packing, about life, about professional stuff, and then some. So let's do that, and we'll gather back in 5 minutes. Thank you.